Ferrari at breakfast on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
9 minutes before 8 is the time. It's good that you were listening to my conversation with the pastor who gave the benediction following the inauguration of President Biden yesterday. Miriam, I think you misheard the pastor. He said it was wonderful to hear him on the radio. I enjoyed watching him on TV. Isn't it fantastic to hear that at Joe Biden's age, the Reverend says he still goes dogging? I think you misheard him. What the Reverend says is he still goes jogging and is very much a keep fit expert. So just to clarify that, Miriam, you slightly misheard, but we will return to the President and your views on that in just a moment. There's a task facing him and, of course, the whole of the world as to how they build back better after the COVID crisis, because we will. And bear in mind how many vaccines we're getting out in the United Kingdom. We will come through this. So what is to be made of a Skills for Jobs initiative, revolutionising education post-16, and what's called reshaping the training landscape? Let's turn to Education Secretary Gavin Williamson with more details. What does this mean for my listeners and perhaps more importantly for their children or even their grandchildren? Good morning.
Good morning, Nick. Well, it's really a focus about, as we come out of this pandemic, is making sure we often have so much discussion about the 50% of young people who go to university. We don't often talk enough about the 50% of young people that don't go to university. And it's making sure that the courses that they do, it's very much following the German and Swiss model, putting businesses, chambers of commerce right at the centre, right at the heart of actually designing these qualifications. So every qualification a young person takes is actually built around giving them the skills to be able to walk into a job. And at the moment, too many of the qualifications aren't focused on where that will take them in terms of the job at the end of it. And by getting chambers of commerce, by getting businesses helping designers to the courses that are on offer, is making sure that those courses are relevant to the local area that college is based in.
How will listeners find out more about these opportunities, Secretary of State?
Well, this is where we've launched the Lifetime Skills Guarantee. We're putting millions of pounds behind it. So if you haven't had like an equivalent of an A-level qualification, no matter what your age is, Nick, I mean, if you yourself, I'm not sure if you did do your A-levels or BTEC equivalent.
No, I did.
I'm afraid the option isn't open to you.
No. I'm so old. I did O-levels, Mr. Williamson. That goes back to those days many years ago.
You look such a young whippersnapper.
Yes, indeed.
Yes, thank you. Down as a GCSE boy.
Right, but as we're discussing exams, Mr. Williamson, perhaps I can take you back to the last time that you and I had a conversation. It was as recently as last month, and you told me this.
And I think if we can run an exam series during a pandemic and a national lockdown, I have every confidence that we're going to be able to run those same exams in 2021 in the summer of next year.
But since then, the exams will not proceed, Secretary of State.
Sadly, Nick, that is the case. And examinations are university accepted as the best form of assessment when we're in a situation, and certainly wasn't a place where we expected to be in another national lockdown where schools had to be in a place where it couldn't have all children back into it. We had to relook at that, and as a result of that, we've had to move to teacher assessment. We feel, in light of the impact on schooling, on education, and while schools are doing amazing jobs in terms of remote education, we felt that we had to take that very difficult decision, and certainly not a decision that we took lightly.
Why as recently as last month were you saying that we would have the exams scheduled?
Well, when I spoke to you last month, you and I weren't aware of the new variant, the impact that the new variant was going to have in terms of the spread of coronavirus. There's a real confidence and belief with the rollout of the vaccine that we were on a very positive trajectory. The new variant that's emerged sadly changed so many considerations, including the Prime Minister and myself have time and time again said, we do not want to be in a situation where we saw schools closing. It was the last thing that we would ever want to see closing. But due to the new variant, we had to make that decision, and that had to change our calculation and our assessment as to whether we could run exams.
It's interesting you would mention schools closing, Secretary of State, because this was my conversation again last month with your colleague, Home Secretary Priti Patel.
So my colleague Gavin Williamson in the Department of Education, we're working with schools to look at the plans for schools going back, but also ensuring that we have the protective and preventative measures in place, such as mass testing, to keep our children safe.
Yes. So how confident are you that they will? So that's the importance of education.
So
and how hard
I'm confident schools will be returning in January.
All pupils.
No doubt about that. I can't tell you about.
No doubt about that. So the assurance that the exams would go ahead was wrong. The assurance that all pupils will be returning was wrong. Why should my listeners have any faith in you and your colleagues?
Well, what we've seen globally is the largest disruption since the Second World War.
I wonder if we could focus on Westminster, though. This is what we hear from you. I hear from Priti Patel. Promises. These are like Mary Poppins. Pie-crust promises. Easy to make, easy to break.
It won't surprise you, Nick. The last thing I ever wanted to see is schools closing again for a second time to, all but the children of critical workers and vulnerable children. But it was a national decision that we had to make in the national interest. We were having to take the really incredibly difficult step as this new variant spread, even more extreme action that we had to do in terms of the second national lockdown, where we'd able to preserve and protect schools by keeping them open. But due to the new variant, we had to make a different decision, and it wasn't one that any of us wanted to make, but it was a position that we found ourselves in.
Right.
And at all stages, and we want to always protect education. That's why schools were the last to close. That is why they'll also be the first to open.
And as part of this, it was announced that there would be daily COVID testing in secondary schools. You hailed this as a milestone, Mr. Williamson. That has now been paused. If you are so determined, why would that be paused?
So there's two types of testing that we sort of do in schools. There's the mass testing, where all those who are coming into school are getting tested, and that's continuing. And we started to roll that out from the 4th of January in terms of literally millions of kits being distributed to schools right across the country. And that's up and running for staff and pupils in secondary schools. And we've rolled that out to all staff in primary schools. I think what you're referring to is the daily testing that we're doing. So if, for example, you had come in contact with your director at LBC who had COVID, you were then made to self-isolate as a result of that. We'd done trials all last year of where in lots of schools across the country, so instead of those pupils having to self-isolate for a period of time, those teachers, they could take a test every single day for 7 days. But what Public Health England have asked us to do is actually pause that scheme while they do an evaluation in relation to the new variant and how that impacts on it. So we're very much hoping to restart that. But the mass testing for all pupils and all staff, that's very much up and running. And of course, it'll be a really important part of bringing schools back and making sure pupils can get back into school.
Let me ask you this. Were you to be required to give you and your colleagues a grade on how you've handled this since December? I'd suggest a C+ could do better. What would you say, Secretary of State for Education?
Nick, it's probably best for others to grade us, but I'm just going to focus on getting schools back, making sure that we deliver on the skills agenda, making sure people, when they're taking their courses at college, are in the best possible position.
Let me ask you then, if you're loath to commit on that, we now know that there was an interesting conversation last year between the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister over whether the borders should have been closed earlier. Whose team were you on then, Mr. Williamson?
We're all on the Prime Minister's team, Nick.
Do you think the borders should have been closed earlier?
the advice that we were getting in terms of the health advice and the scientific advice was that wasn't necessary and actually potentially would have an adverse effect. So the Prime Minister and government quite understandably listened to the best.
How could it have had an adverse, as regards the virus? I can see an adverse effect economically. As regards the virus, how could it have had an adverse effect, Secretary of State?
Well, the advice that we'd had from, there was no advice in terms of closing the borders down at that stage. And we have to understand that the understanding of coronavirus has grown massively over the past few months. This is a new disease, and actually, if you look at the start of it, there was no requirement, even if you were doing international air travel, to be even wearing masks or anything else like that. So that understanding of how the virus transmits, how it actually passes from one person to the other, has changed so very, very much. And as a result of better understanding of the virus, we have had to change policies.
And is one of those policies, as is suggested today, we might have what are called quarantine hotels?
Yeah. Well, the government will always look at all the options. That isn't something that the government is proposing at the moment. But we've got a set of travel restrictions in order to be able to protect the population here in the UK. If the scientific and medical advice is to do more, of course, the government would always look at doing more.
Finally, coming back very much to your brief of education, you'll be aware of the Sutton Trust, and they've reported that just a quarter of working-class children are doing 5 hours of schoolwork a day, and there are education experts who are very concerned the gulf between the children perhaps who need education the most are getting it the least, and also the government providing them with computer kit or laptops. A comment on that, if you would, Secretary of State.
Well, I think it's a really important report. And actually, we've been listening to some of the concerns that, many people have been voicing. That's why we've put much more strict standards that all schools have to follow for all pupils. And actually, as a result of that, we believe that the delivery of remote education will be much, much higher. And we want to be able to close that gap. That's why we're investing in 1.3 million laptops and tablets going out to schools on top of the 2.9 million estimated laptops and tablets that they've already got in schools. That's why we've also said, children who don't have access to the internet or to a laptop, they're able to be classed as a vulnerable child, they're able to come into school to get their education directly. We've taken these measures and, strict measures, and saying that this is what we're expecting schools to deliver. It's what we're saying that schools have got to deliver, because we've got to do everything we can do to close that gap.
Grateful for your time today. Thank you. Education Secretary Gavin Williamson appearing here on LBC, where it's 3 minutes after 8. News is next.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, Joe Biden has used the first hours of his presidency to sign a series of executive orders dismantling Donald Trump's legacy. The first was related to the coronavirus pandemic, mandating the